Hello guys, welcome to Hidden Timelines. Tonight we open with a detail that history often glances over, but once heard it refuses to leave you. For nearly half a minute after beheading a human head may remain conscious, the eyes can blink, the lips may try to form words, awareness lingers caught between life and silence. Imagine those seconds, the terror, the confusion, the body refusing to accept the truth. That interval, so brief yet unbearable, almost certainly belonged to Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII. Hers was not simply an execution, it was a carefully choreographed finale designed not only to end a life, but to dismantle a legacy. Anne's death in May 1536 is one of the most infamous in English history, yet even now the brutal reality of what unfolded is often softened into legend, a clean sword stroke, a solemn farewell. The truth is far darker. In Tudor England, death was rarely punishment alone. It was spectacle theatre, a morality play staged for the maximum effect. Executions were not private acts of justice, but public rituals deliberately crafted to remind the people and the nobility of where power truly lay. Every scaffold was a stage, every crowd an audience, every body a prop in the king's performance. Anne's story was no different. She was not executed simply for treason. Her final days reveal a campaign of psychological torment as deliberate as the sword stroke that severed her head. Henry VIII did not only want her dead, he wanted her erased. By May 19th, Anne had been imprisoned in the Tower of London for 17 days. That fortress had once prepared her for majesty 3 years earlier. She had processed through its gates for her coronation as Queen of England. Now its stone walls closed around her as prison, stripping away dignity with every echoing footstep. The king dragged out her agony by repeatedly postponing her execution. A cruel tactic in itself, this left her in constant dread, never knowing which morning would be her last. And though later historians framed Henry's choice of a French swordsman instead of an English axe as an act of mercy to Anne, it was just another reminder that her death would be staged as theatre-imported spectacle to add drama to her downfall. Yet within this cruelty, witnesses noted something extraordinary: Anne's composure. She joked, she smiled, she quipped about her little neck. Some saw serenity, others something far stranger, the fractured calm of a mind enduring the unbearable. Today, psychologists might call it dissociation, the mind's instinct to retreat, to cloak itself in unnatural cheerfulness when reality is too terrifying to face. But beneath her wit and her laughter, the torment was immeasurable. She knew the accusations against her were lies, adultery, incest, even conspiring to kill the king. Charges so grotesque they would have been laughed out of any fair court. Yet in Henry's England, they became tools of propaganda. Anne was no longer a wife, a queen, or a mother. She was rewritten into a villain, condemned not only in law but in memory. The chilling truth is this: Henry VIII sought not just Anne's death but her annihilation. Her name was to be scrubbed from palaces, her portraits destroyed, her daughter, Elizabeth, stripped of legitimacy. In a world where image was everything, Anne's very existence was recast as disgrace. And so what awaited her was not merely the clean slice of a sword, but a performance of humiliation staged for the benefit of king and country. Her execution was meant to convince all of England that she had never deserved the crown, that she had always been a fraud, a traitor, a woman whose ambition was dangerous enough to merit erasure. On the morning of May 19th, the sky over London was uncharacteristically bright, mocking the darkness that awaited Anne. The night before, she had prayed instead of slept, kneeling for hours until dawn. By the time she was summoned from her chambers, she had been awake nearly a full day, exhausted, frightened, yet curiously animated. Reports describe her laughing with her attendants, a strange mixture of hysteria and gallows courage. Her execution had already been delayed several times, each postponement gnawing at her sanity. To the Tudors, uncertainty was a form of torture more effective than any rack or whip. Not knowing when the axe, or in this case the sword, would fall drove prisoners deeper into despair than the death itself. When the moment finally arrived, Anne walked the halls of the tower she had once crossed as queen. No courtiers bowed now, no musicians played. Only guards escorted her, not with ceremony, but with the cold assurance that no escape was possible. This then is where her story begins for us, at the threshold of Tower Green, with a scaffold not raised high to honour her status, but lowered only 3 feet to strip her of dignity, to press her closer to the jeering crowd. What was to follow would not be justice but theatre. Anne's execution was a script carefully written by Henry and Cromwell, an ending designed to terrify, to humiliate, to erase. And in the silence before the sword fell, in those last flickers of consciousness, science tells us may remain. Anne Boleyn's final awareness was not only of death but of betrayal. This was not the fall of a queen. It was the unveiling of power's cruelest mask. The Tower of London is a fortress layered with contradictions. Its grey walls have seen triumph and terror, coronations and executions, feasts and funerals. To enter its gates was to step into a place where the lines between majesty and despair blurred. For Anne Boleyn, no irony could have been crueler. In June of 1533 she had passed beneath those same stone arches, not as a prisoner but as a bride queen. Trumpets had sounded, crowds had cheered, and the Tower had been her gilded antechamber to coronation. Only 3 years later the same walls closed around her like a coffin. Anne was confined in the royal apartments of the Tower, the very chambers prepared for queens. This was not mercy but symbolism. Henry wanted her to remember with every step how swiftly her fortunes had turned. She who once waited there to be crowned now awaited a sword. The air itself must have felt no different. Once filled with the scent of flowers, silks rustling, laughter of ladies in waiting, now heavy with damp stone, hushed whispers, and the clink of chains echoing from nearby cells. Her imprisonment stretched to 17 days. 17 days of dread of rehearsing her death in the mind of imagining the crowd's gaze, the cold platform, the blade. Worse still, her end was not scheduled with certainty. Henry postponed her execution multiple times, each delay twisting the knife of anticipation. To live each morning, thinking it might be the last, only to have the sentence deferred, was a form of psychological torment as deliberate as any physical torture. Contemporary accounts suggest Anne's composure was remarkable, yet this calm was fractured by such delays. One day she was told she would die at dawn, the next that her end had been postponed until noon, then again that it was delayed until the following day. The rhythm of death was never steady, always shifting, always keeping her mind raw with uncertainty. This was no accident. In Tudor justice, the waiting was part of the punishment. Then came the chilling detail that marked her fate, Henry's decision to bring in a French executioner. At first glance it seemed an odd courtesy. English custom favoured the axe, a brutal instrument often requiring multiple blows. The French, however, employed the sword, a single practiced stroke said to be quicker, cleaner, yes, more merciful. But for Anne, the presence of a foreign executioner was not a gift. It was theatre. Henry spared no expense. The swordsman was summoned from Calais, the cost extravagant. This was no ordinary execution. It was a performance staged with props and precision. To die at the hands of an outsider underscored her alienation. She was not to be executed as an English queen, but cut down by a stranger's blade, severed even from her homeland in her final instant. The sword itself became a symbol of her otherness, the woman who had overturned tradition, only to be destroyed by a tradition not her own. The Tower's role in this drama carried heavy political weight. In Tudor England, executions of high rank were rarely conducted in the common squares. To kill a queen demanded both privacy and spectacle, a paradox the Tower alone could provide. Tower Green was secluded yet accessible to the nobles and select witnesses whose presence would lend legitimacy to the act. The architecture itself seemed designed for such moments, walls to contain gates, to control courtyards to stage. For Henry, Anne's imprisonment in the Tower was a message written in stone. Every nobleman who entered those gates to observe her downfall was reminded that the monarchy's power could elevate or annihilate at will. To ordinary Londoners hearing the bells toll or catching glimpses of the scaffold's preparations, the message was just as clear: if a crowned queen could be destroyed, then no one was safe. The Tower was not just a prison, it was propaganda in brick and mortar. Its looming walls turned Anne's confinement into a symbol, her silence into a lesson. Here amid the ravens and shadows, her fate was no longer her own. It was a script performed for king court and kingdom alike. And so day by day Anne waited in those royal apartments, knowing that the sound of footsteps on the stair might be the summons to her death. Every hour was stretched taut with dread, every delay another twist of the knife. The Tower that had once crowned her queen now rehearsed her erasure. Witnesses at the Tower were struck by something uncanny. Anne Boleyn did not weep, did not scream, did not rage. Instead, she laughed. She smiled at her attendants. She even joked about her little neck tilting her head with gallows humour, as though she could somehow diminish the enormity of what awaited her. To her ladies, her cheerfulness seemed surreal. To later generations, it became part of her legend. But beneath that smile lay a darker truth. What looked like serenity may in fact have been dissociation, the mind's last desperate defence against unendurable trauma. Psychologists today describe dissociation as a protective fracture, a way of stepping outside of one's own terror. For a queen awaiting death on charges she knew were absurd, it was perhaps the only armour she had left. Her laughter was not joy, but survival, a mask worn for herself as much as for the world watching. Anne's composure becomes even more haunting when weighed against the accusations levelled at her. Adultery, incest with her own brother, and conspiracy to kill the king, charges so grotesque they strain belief. No credible evidence existed. The men accused alongside her were condemned on the flimsiest of testimony, their trials a formality rather than a search for truth. In Tudor England, the court was not a place of justice but of performance, and Anne was the centrepiece of Cromwell's play. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, was the architect of her downfall. Brilliant, ruthless, and pragmatic Cromwell understood that Anne's removal was necessary for Henry's ambitions. She had failed to provide a male heir, her influence had become politically dangerous, and her enemies at court grew more numerous with each passing year. Cromwell engineered her trial with chilling precision. He fed rumours into the court's veins, whispers of flirtations, glances, misinterpreted, private words twisted into treason. What might have been laughed off in another time became deadly when framed as betrayal of the king. Cromwell knew how to spin the narrative. Anne's wit became insolence, her charm became seduction, her sharp mind became scheming. Even her brother George was dragged into the mire, accused of incest, not because the charge was plausible, but because its very obscenity ensured that the Queen's reputation would be irreparably stained. This was not justice, but propaganda. Henry needed more than Anne's death. He needed her disgrace. To destroy her image was to secure his own. If Anne could be cast as a seductress, a witch, a traitor, then Henry would be free to remarry without scandal, his honour intact, his conscience masked by lies. Cromwell's machinery ensured that by the time Anne stepped onto the scaffold, she was not a queen, but a caricature, a villain in a morality play staged for England's reassurance. And yet Anne met this storm of falsehoods not with shrieking denials, but with eerie calm. Her smiles, her quips, her jokes about her neck, these became her final defiance. If she could not control the verdict, she could at least control her demeanour. The state could strip her of titles, destroy her name, erase her memory, but it could not make her cower. In those fleeting days, Anne wore composure as her last crown. Her enemies might have expected her to collapse under the weight of scandal, to go mad with grief to confirm the hysteria they painted around her. Instead, she smiled. That smile, trembling though it was, became a crack in the facade of power proof that, even in the shadow of death, a woman could remain untamed. Anne's laughter in the tower was not the laugh of a fool, it was the laugh of someone who saw the play for what it was, a stage managed by Cromwell, directed by Henry, and performed at her expense. If she was to be their spectacle, she would at least write her own final line. If justice had been the point, the records would look different. There would be evidence, weighed doubts, acknowledged caution exercised when a crown and a soul were at stake. But the paper trail from spring 1536 reveals another goal, entirely not judgment but deletion. Henry VIII did not simply mean to end Anne Boleyn. He meant to rub her out of England's memory, and with her the legitimacy of a small red-haired child named Elizabeth. Death was the instrument. Erasure was the policy. You can see the outline of the plan in the sequence. First came the arrest, swift and bewildering, then the charges noisome and impossible to refute once confession had been made into treason's shadow. Next, the careful positioning of witnesses, proclamations, and sermons' voices that would echo the same tune until it sounded like truth. Finally, the most important move of all, the rewriting of succession, reshaping the law so that a living child became a legal phantom. This was not a single event, but a design, a choreography of reputation. The Tudor state understood something. Modern regimes also know the story is as powerful as the sentence. So it set its instruments humming. Proclamations announced the Queen's faults in sanitized but unmistakable language. Royal preachers wove obedience and a moral panic into their Sunday words, making Anne's fall a warning and a lesson. Courtiers learned the new script overnight, names not to say portraits, not to praise initials to overlook on tapestries and gatehouses. Printers too felt the current. The king's printer did not need a written order to grasp that one face was no longer to be multiplied in ink. In some palaces, the interlaced HE, Henry and Anne, was quietly carved out, replaced or left to weather into nothing. The country would remember the less said the better. Cromwell's genius lay in giving the king's will a bureaucratic body. He knew the arteries of information, ambassadorial dispatches, rumour at court reports from the shires, the pulpit, the press, the carefully managed spectacle of royal progress. If you could shape those arteries, you could control how the nation felt by Michaelmas about a thing that had happened in May. And so he did. He ensured that by the time Anne mounted the scaffold, most who mattered had already rehearsed the version that would outlive her not tragic queen, but dangerous woman. Not mother of a princess, but corrupter of the realm. Not victim of policy, but author of her own ruin. Erasure has precedents. The English knew the trick long before Henry. Richard III, in a different century's dusk, met a problem he could not solve with tenderness 2 boys in a tower. The truth of their fate remains fog, but the method is vivid silence, doors closed, faces withdrawn from public view. When a figure cannot be safely displayed, the state learns to hide them until the world blinks and forgets. Later storytellers would paint Richard with shadows thick as tar, but the essential tactic, the starving of memory, is familiar. It is a cousin to what Henry attempted, make the disappearance dull and the replacement glitter. In 1536, the glitter would be Jane Seymour, a promise of sons to wash the stain away. Closer still stands Catherine Howard, Anne's cousin, and future 6th Queen, executed in 1542. If Anne's destruction was the work of a state that wanted the past annulled, Catherine's was a redaction of the present. Her emblems vanished, her household scattered, her name turned into a chisel used on other women. Be obedient, be silent, be pure, or watch how quickly the stones forget you. There is a line between the 2 heads, Anne's and Catherine's, a thread of policy tight as wire. When a woman disrupts the narrative of male succession, the scaffold becomes an editor. The blade removes a body, the state removes a history. Henry's intention, though, was more ambitious than Richard's silence or Catherine's cautionary erasure. He meant to unmake the mother to unmake the child. Acts of Parliament followed cold in their clarity. The new succession would leap over Elizabeth's small hands as though she had never existed in rightful blood. It is hard to imagine the private arithmetic of such cruelty to deny your daughter not merely comfort or place, but legitimacy itself, to bury her title with her mother and call it order. Yet this was the core of the plan. Anne's memory could be managed with chisels and sermons. Elizabeth's legal self would be extinguished in ink. The propaganda network worked like rain through thatch, slow at first, then everywhere. Courtiers performed distance. Ambassadors wrote home in tones calibrated to please. Ballads did their sly labour in taverns, moulding thought-through tune. Even the pageant of Anne's end was cast to align with the story The Borrowed French Swordsman, the muted crowd of those allowed to see the swift stroke that could be praised as mercy by those who needed mercy to cover their shame. And when the head was gone, the story continued. No coffin prepared. A chest, a hurried burial. Let the queen vanish into the floor of a chapel frequented by soldiers and sparrows. Let the memory lose its sharpness in the ordinary shuffle of feet. Let the next bride take the light. Shaping absence also required shining presence. The court pivoted with unnerving cord to setting the stage for Jane Seymour's quiet virtue. Public feeling needed a salve, and so Jane was framed as the medicine modest, where Anne had been brilliant compliant, where Anne had been combative fertile, where Anne had failed. This is another rule of erasure. You do not only remove, you replace with something that makes forgetting feel like safety. The space in the mind that once held Anne would be filled with an image of English motherhood suitable to a king's need. If we step back, the pattern hardens into something older than Tudor policy, Rome's Damnatio. Memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Chisel away the name, face the statue to the wall, relabel the relief. But the Romans faced a problem. Henry Wood II power is best at altering public surfaces. It is weakest against private recall. A maid keeps a ribbon, a clerk preserves a copy, a poet remembers a face, and a child grows learning to walk through halls whose stones still whisper. The state can erase the signposts. It cannot retile the sky. This is not to say Henry failed in the moment. He succeeded terribly well. For a season, Anne was remembered as the lesson-desired ambition, punished immodesty, scourged treason, extinguished with neat foreign steel. The legal devices were airtight, the sermons effective, the courtiers' mouths disciplined. Even the architecture obeyed, losing its entwined initials as if they had never curled there. The nation moved on, the king remarried. The table was reset, but erasure has a half-life. It decays when confronted by a survivor who refuses to remain footnote. The future had already begun its slow correction in a cradle. Elizabeth the child declared a nullity would grow into the monarch whose reign would wrap Henry's line in the glory he'd bled others to achieve. When she reached for the sceptre, she did so with a memory no sermon could cauterize. The The state had attempted to delete a mother. The daughter became an era. The lesson is blunt: when a ruler chooses annihilation over justice, the stain spreads. It touches law and liturgy, art and rumour the very way a people remembers itself. Henry's intention was to close a chapter so firmly that no one would read it again. Instead, he pressed the page with such force that the words bled through the paper below. We read them still through the palimpsest of propaganda, through the scraped-off monograms, and revised successions through the sermons that told the flock to forget. What remains stubborn as breath is not the erasure, but the effort to erase proof that power's deepest fear is not rebellion, but remembrance. And so we return to the tower, to the royal apartments turned cell, to the whole short scaffold and the long mourning. Justice did not climb those steps. Policy did. The blade did not only divide a neck, it attempted to sever a nation from one of its own stories. Yet history has a contrary habit. It keeps the inconvenient figures in the margins until someone lifts the page to the light. Then, faint but undeniable, the erased lines reappear. The night before Anne Boleyn's execution stretched long and merciless. In the dark silence of the tower she could not rest. Sleep refused her, and instead she sought solace in prayer. Records tell us she requested the sacrament at 2 a.m, kneeling for hours in a state that must have been equal parts devotion and desperation. Imagine her a queen turned prisoner, her hands clasped her lips, moving in the whispered supplication, the candlelight flickering against stone walls that had once echoed with coronation song. This vigil was not the composure of a serene saint, but the restless anguish of a woman on the edge of annihilation. The human body frays under such conditions. Days of uncertainty, nights without sleep, and the relentless shifting of the execution hour eat away at the mind. Anne had endured this cycle repeatedly, each postponement sharpening the blade not just for her neck, but for her spirit. To be told that you will die at dawn, only to have the hour delayed again and again, it was a cruelty designed to break the strongest resolve. By the time the morning arrived, Anne had been awake nearly a full day, and yet when she emerged from her chamber, the witnesses saw not a woman collapsing in despair, but one laughing, animated, and strangely bright. She exchanged jokes with her attendants, smiling at moments when her heart surely recoiled. This jarring demeanour puzzled her contemporaries. Was she fearless? Was she mad? Modern psychology offers a clearer lens. The phenomenon is known as the psychological breaking point of anticipation. To live in suspended dread of death is in many cases harder than death itself. Prisoners subjected to indefinite delays often display unusual behaviours: hysterical laughter, unnerving calm, exaggerated cheerfulness. These are not signs of serenity, but symptoms of a mind stretched to its limits. Laughter becomes a shield against terror, a mask to cover the raw fracture beneath. In Tudor England, this tactic was deliberate. The authorities understood that uncertainty gnawed at prisoners more effectively than chains. The shifting of execution times, the repeated summoning and dismissal, the withholding of information, all were forms of psychological torture. The goal was not only to kill the body, but to unmake the person before the blade fell, to ensure that by the time they stepped onto the scaffold, they were already a ghost of themselves. Anne endured this torment with a resilience that startled those around her. Even her gallows humour, her remark about her little neck, can be read not as frivolity, but as a weapon. She was being humiliated, degraded, erased. Yet with one line she claimed authorship of the moment, turning the king's cruel script into her own. Still beneath that brittle wit, exhaustion gnawed. Hours of prayer had left her weak, her body trembling from lack of rest. Accounts suggest she leaned heavily on her attendants that morning, not because she feared to fall apart in public, but because she was physically spent. And yet she forced herself upright, determined that her enemies would not see her broken. The night before the sword fell, Anne lived in a world stripped of certainty, her every breath shadowed by dread, but she carried herself as though she were still Queen Laughing, praying, refusing to cower. In that sleepless vigil she revealed the paradox of her final hours, a woman already destroyed by policy, and yet somehow unbroken in spirit. The morning of May 19th broke clear over London, and within the tower the long walk began. Anne Boleyn was summoned from the royal apartments she had once occupied as queen, her body weakened from sleepless prayer, her spirit taut with dread and strange determination. What had been a place of glory now unfolded as a corridor of humiliation. Just 3 years before she had processed through those same halls with courtiers, bowing servants, scattering flowers and musicians filling the air with triumph. Now there was no music, No courtiers, no bows, only guards, their armour clinking in the stillness, their faces impassive. The walk itself was short, but it carried the weight of years. The Tower of London was built to amplify authority, narrow corridors that forced slow movement, staircases that made each step echo courtyards that turned a prisoner's passage into a public display. Every stone had been designed to remind those within it of power's grip, and on execution days the architecture became part of the ritual. Windows filled with watching eyes, courtyards swelled with whispers. The air itself seemed to press downward as though the walls had seen too much blood and had grown heavy with memory. Anne walked with dignity, her head held high. Yet she could not escape the silence that followed her. Where once noblemen would have bent their knee, now they averted their eyes, afraid to be seen, showing loyalty to a woman condemned. The courtiers who had fawned upon her were absent. Those who did linger stood with stiff indifference, their silence as sharp as a blade. The message was unmistakable. She was no longer queen, no longer even wife, but traitor. Ahead of her the path wound toward Tower Green, a small patch of grass within the fortress walls chosen for private executions of the highborn. Unlike the spectacle of Tyburn, where common criminals met their end, before roaring crowds Tower Green offered a controlled stage. Only select witnesses were admitted. Nobles, ambassadors, officials, each chosen not for compassion, but for their usefulness in carrying the story outward. The fall of a queen had to be witnessed, retold, and spread like ink on parchment, yet managed to avoid the chaos of a mob. Even so, the atmosphere of the tower on such a day was tense, charged a mixture of solemnity and carnival. For those who attended it was both horror and privilege, the chance to see history unfold, the downfall of a queen, the spectacle of royal justice. Accounts tell us that crowds murmured, some with pity, others with morbid curiosity, still others with satisfaction. After all, Anne had been painted as a seductress, a traitor to king and country. To witness her fall was to see the king's authority reasserted, justice performed before their very eyes. For the Tudors' execution was not only punishment but pedagogy. It taught lessons, obedience, loyalty, fear. The scaffold was a classroom where subjects learned the price of defiance. When the condemned was a queen, the lesson was sharper still. Even the highest rank offered no protection from the king's will. Anne's walk through the tower was a sermon in motion, every footstep reinforcing the message that power could make and unmake at whim. As she emerged into the light of Tower Green, the scaffold awaited her. Low, only 3 feet high, it was designed not to elevate her as queen, but to diminish her, to bring her closer to the jeering whispers of the crowd. The grass beneath her feet, the wood under her hands, the pale faces turned toward her, all of it, part of a theatre in which she was both actor and victim. The walk was brief, but its meaning immense. It was the transition from life to symbol, from queen to warning. The silence of courtiers, the presence of guards, the watchful eyes of the tower all converged to erase Anne's past and script her into a new role. Not consort, not mother, but traitor. And as she mounted the steps, the crowd leaned forward not just to see a woman die, but to witness the king's authority reaffirm itself in flesh and blood. On Tower Green, the scaffold stood waiting. It was nothing grand, just a low wooden platform hastily constructed no more than 3 feet high. In popular imagination we picture towering stasia that elevated the condemned above the sea of faces decked, solemn platforms, these draped in black. But Anne Boleyn's scaffold was deliberately modest, close to the ground, designed not to honour her rank but to strip it away. A queen was meant to look up from the crowd. On this day the crowd looked down on her. That low height was humiliation in architecture. It pressed Anne physically closer to the murmurs and glares of those assembled, denied her the symbolic loftiness that might have preserved some aura of majesty. She was made smaller, diminished, forced into proximity with the jeers of strangers. The message was clear. She was no longer a queen elevated above her people, but a condemned traitor brought low before them. The scaffold itself was stark. Freshly laid planks stained with sawdust, but perhaps also with older blood, for Tower Green had seen other noble deaths, and would see more still. The wood creaked beneath each footfall, reminding all present that this stage was temporarily built for the performance of annihilation, and then dismantled, leaving only memory behind. The atmosphere was not solemn, not reverent. Accounts suggest it resembled more a carnival, a grim festival of human frailty. Vendors sometimes gathered at the edges of execution sites selling food, drink and trinkets, the ordinary commerce of life colliding with extraordinary death. Even in the more exclusive space of Tower Green, the mood had that same unsettled energy. People leaned forward whispering, craning their necks to see some with pity, some with morbid excitement. A few perhaps even laughed. Executions were after all entertainment as much as punishment. This was one of the strangest paradoxes of Tudor England justice was theatre. Punishment was meant to be seen. The scaffold was not only a place of death, but a stage where authority performed itself. The condemned acted their parts penitent sinner, dignified noble, humbled traitor. The crowd served as witness and chorus, their reactions feeding back into the meaning of the event. And the king, though absent in body, was always present in intention, his will manifested in the wood, the sword, and the silence of those who dared not protest. For Anne, this theatre was especially cruel. Once she had been the star of coronation pageants, the glittering centre of masks and processions. Now she was the central figure of another kind of play, one staged to obliterate her name. The scaffold was her final stage, and the performance demanded of her was submission. And yet even in this setting, Anne retained a sliver of power. The scaffold required her presence. The execution could not proceed without her words, her posture, her final act. Though the state intended to humiliate her, she still had the chance to shape the impression she left upon those gathered. Every glance, every phrase, every movement on that low wooden stage would ripple outward into memory retold in taverns, repeated in chronicles, preserved in whispers. Thus the scaffold was more than a killing ground. It was a contested space between royal authority and individual defiance, between humiliation and dignity, between the state's story and the condemned's last attempt to write their own. For Anne Boleyn, that fragile balance would play out in her final speech. When Anne Boleyn mounted the scaffold, she carried with her one final duty to speak. In Tudor England, the condemned were expected to deliver last words, a ritual older than memory. These speeches were not spontaneous outpourings of conscience, but performances under strict expectation. To defy the script was dangerous. To fulfill it too well was to lend legitimacy to the very system that condemned you. Anne's final words survive in several accounts, each slightly different, but all carrying the same shape. She addressed the crowd as good Christian people, and declared that she came to die according to the law. She did not deny the charges outright, but neither did she confess guilt. Instead, she praised the king, the man who'd condemned her as a gracious and merciful prince. She urged those present to pray for him and for her. On the surface, these were words of submission. They painted a picture of a queen who accepted her fate, who bore no ill will, who deferred to the king's justice, but beneath that surface lay a blade as sharp as the one about to end her life. Anne acknowledged the law, but not her guilt. She accepted judgment, but not truth. And by framing her words in this way, she slipped a subtle defiance past the scaffold's censors. It was in essence an act of survival beyond survival. Anne understood that even in death, her words would be carried outward by those in attendance, repeated in whispers, retold in letters, recorded in chronicles. A single phrase could echo for generations. She could not save her life, but she could try to salvage her dignity, perhaps even her daughter's. The ritual of the final speech was double-edged. It was meant to affirm the justice of the state, to turn the condemned into a living witness against themselves. But in skilled hands it could be turned to subversion. Anne's speech walked this tightrope, outwardly obedient, inwardly unyielding. To a fearful public she appeared compliant. To those who listened more closely she left behind the faint trace of resistance, the refusal to concede guilt even with the blade a breath away. The moment was all the more chilling because of Henry's absence. The king who had once worshipped her as the jewel of his court did not watch her fall. He remained at Whitehall awaiting the signal of her death with a cold detachment, already dreaming of his next wife. His absence spoke louder than any speech. Anne's life mattered so little to him that he would not even trouble himself with her final breath. But Henry's absence did not mean he was absent from the ritual. Every word Anne spoke was measured against the knowledge that they would be carried back to him. Her speech was in effect dictated by his shadow. Too much defiance and Elizabeth might suffer. Too much silence and her enemies would write her final chapter for her. Anne balanced on the edge of that sword with the same composure she had shown throughout her imprisonment, crafting words that outwardly served her executioners but inwardly preserved a sliver of her truth. And here lies the cruel genius of Tudor power. Even death was scripted. Even the last words of a queen were censored, constrained, shaped into propaganda. The scaffold was not only the end of a body, but the beginning of a narrative, one designed to teach obedience and sanctify the king's authority. Anne knew this, and so she played her role with precision, a queen's poise in the face of erasure, her voice echoing over Tower Green, her words slipping between submission and defiance. Those words carried outward by the crowd became the only weapon left to her, a fragile shield against the silence Henry meant to impose. Among the strangest and most telling details of Anne Boleyn's execution was the presence of a man who had never once stood in her court bowed to her crown or spoken her name with loyalty. Henry VIII had summoned a French executioner famed for his precision with the sword and paid dearly for his services. This man, a stranger, would be the last figure Anne ever saw. To many chroniclers, this choice has long been framed as an act of mercy. The axe, England's traditional tool of execution, was notoriously unreliable. Even skilled headsmen sometimes required multiple blows to sever a neck, and the failures were remembered with horror. The Duke of Somerset's botched beheading decades later would require more than 3 strokes. The sword, by contrast, was swifter, cleaner, requiring only one decisive cut across the side of the neck. Henry, so the story went, had given Anne this gift of a merciful end, but mercy is not always what it seems. For Anne, the French swordsman was no act of kindness. It was another calculated humiliation. A Queen of England was not to be executed in the English way by one of her own subjects. Instead, her final moment was handed to a foreigner, a man imported like a stage prop for a play, carefully choreographed by Henry and Cromwell. In life, Anne had been accused of being too foreign herself, too French in her manners, too continental in her style. Now in death, even her execution bore the stamp of otherness. The symbolism ran deep. The axe was brutal, yes, but it was familiar. To die by the English axe was to die within the framework of one's own nation. To die by a French sword was to be a strange cut down, not as an English queen, but as something alien. The choice underscored Henry's intention to strip Anne of intimacy, of belonging, of the smallest shred of home in her final hour. Even the blow that killed her would not come from her own people. The technique itself was markedly different. The English axe required the condemned to lay their head on a block, face turned sideways, hands bound or held down. It was a position of helpless submission, head pinned to the wood, awaiting the downward chop. The French method was more unnerving. Still, the condemned knelt upright, head free, body exposed. The executioner would distract them with words or gestures, then strike suddenly from behind, or the side, severing the head in a single horizontal sweep. For Anne, this meant that her final posture was one of extraordinary composure. She was not forced to the ground, but required to hold herself still upright, blindfolded, waiting for the sound she would never hear, the rush of steel. It demanded immense courage and stillness, a test not just of body but of nerve. And what of the man himself, this swordsman from Calais? His name is lost, swallowed in the silence of time, but accounts tell us he had honed his skill through years of practice, some even saying he had rehearsed on animals before making the voyage to England. He was a professional, detached, efficient. To him, Anne was another commission, another body, another fee. To Anne, he was the embodiment of the cruelest twist of fate, a stranger who would erase her existence with a single movement, then vanish back across the channel, with his purse heavy and his conscience lightened by craft. This was the final insult. Not only was Anne abandoned by her king, betrayed by her council, and condemned by her court, she was also denied even the intimacy of a familiar hand in death. Her fate rested in the arms of a man who had never sworn her loyalty, never sung her praise, never shared her language of home. The stranger's blade was a symbol of her isolation, a queen reduced to nothing, dispatched by one who owed her nothing. And so the scaffold waited, the sword gleaming, the crowd holding its breath. The Frenchman's presence was not mercy, but theatre, one more calculated detail in a performance designed to humiliate, estrange, and annihilate. Anne Boleyn knelt upon the scaffold, not bound, not pinned against a block, but upright the French way. The English axe required the condemned to stretch their neck across wood pressed down into submission. The French custom, by contrast, demanded poise. The body held still, the neck bared, the condemned required to kneel in fragile composure while death approached in silence. Anne's eyes were blindfolded, her lips moving in prayer. The blindfold, though often framed as mercy, was in truth practical to prevent flinching, to ensure stillness. Yet in the darkness behind the cloth the mind unravels. The condemned does not know the moment the blade will fall. The air hums with dread, every second stretching longer, every sound a footstep, a cough, the shifting of cloth magnified into terror. The French swordsman was known for his technique. He would sometimes distract the victim with words, perhaps calling for an attendant or asking for the sword itself, striking in the moment of reflexive distraction. Swift, clean, efficient. But for Anne, the waiting was the greater torture. blindfolded upright, praying she was suspended in an eternity of anticipation, her whole being listening for the rush of steel she would never hear. Then in an instant it was done. The blade flashed a single horizontal sweep. The crowd saw it more than Anne ever could. The clean arc, the sudden spray, the head severed with almost surgical precision. By Tudor standards, hers was a merciful death, no repeated blows, no groans, no clumsy hacking. The sword did its work in one stroke. And yet mercy is an illusion here, for death is rarely immediate. Reports say Anne's lips continued to move as though her prayer was interrupted but not silenced. Witnesses swore her eyes flickered beneath the blindfold, her body twitching in brief, unsettling spasms. The executioner had severed head from body, but for a handful of seconds the stubborn machinery of life clung to its rhythm. Modern medicine offers grim confirmation. When the brain is severed from the body, consciousness can linger for several seconds. Electrical activity continues, reflexes twitch, eyes blink. Accounts of the French Revolution centuries later describe guillotined heads, grimacing lips, forming words, eyes fixing in recognition. Science explains what Anne's contemporaries only felt as horror the brain may remain aware for up to half a minute after decapitation. For those gathered at Tower Green, it was enough to shake the air. A few turned away, unable to watch, some fainted. Others stared transfixed as though unable to look away from the grotesque miracle of life clinging to flesh already divided. Anne's composure had carried her to the edge of the blade. What followed belonged to the uncanny persistence of the human body. The swordsman lifted her head high by the hair crimson dripping in the morning light. The silence broken by gasps and shouts. A queen had become a warning, a woman transformed into spectacle. Yet in those flickers, the lips moving, the eyes trembling, Anne's humanity intruded upon the theatre, reminding all who watched that this was no neat morality play, but a brutal destruction of a living soul. The blade fell once. But its echo, the prayer unfinished, the eyes still moving, lingered far longer. The sword had done its work, but even in death Anne Boleyn was denied the honour once promised to her as a crowned Queen of England. There was no coffin waiting on Tower Green, no velvet pall, no procession of nobles to carry her body with dignity to its rest. Instead, the women who had attended her in life were forced to attend her in death and to improvise. Overcome with grief, Anne's attendants gathered what they could find. There was no casket prepared, so they pressed into service an old elm chest. Some accounts say one once used to store arrows. Into this crude box they laid her head and body hastily wrapped in linen. The chest was too small ill-fitting for the remains of a queen, and the act itself was a humiliation, almost as calculated as the execution. Anne's remains were carried into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the small church within the tower's walls. There she was buried hurriedly, without ceremony, without requiem, without even a marker to distinguish her grave. The woman who had once been crowned with a golden diadem in Westminster Abbey, celebrated in a pageant of triumph as Henry's consort, was now lowered into an unmarked grave indistinguishable from the anonymous dead who filled the tower's earth. The contrast was staggering. When Anne was crowned queen in 1533, the rituals of magnificence were carefully staged. Her procession through London was lavish streets carpeted with flowers, fountains flowing with wine, her crown glittering as the people gazed upon her in awe. The monarchy had spared no expense to proclaim her legitimacy and splendour. That same monarchy 3 years later could not spare a coffin. The absence of ritual was not oversight, it was policy. A proper funeral would have acknowledged Anne as queen given her death, a measure of dignity that Henry refused her. Instead, her hurried burial was intended to erase. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula became a vault of political convenience, holding not only Anne but many others who had been sacrificed to the shifting tides of Tudor power. Her grave remained unmarked for centuries, lost among the stones until rediscovered in the 19th century. In royal tradition, funerals were more than private grief. They were political theatre affirmations of legitimacy processions that bound people to monarchy through ritual. Anne was denied all of this. Her erasure was carried out not just in life, but in death. By refusing her a coffin, Henry denied her body respect. By refusing her a funeral, he denied her the honour due to a queen. By refusing her a marked grave, he attempted to deny her even the memory of existence. The cruelty becomes sharper when we remember how Henry himself would be laid to rest in splendour, entombed in St. George's Chapel at Windsor. His coffin richly adorned, his name secured in stone. Anne, by contrast, was shoved into a chest, buried hastily, her name unspoken. and yet erasure never fully succeeds. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula became infamous precisely because it held the forgotten. Tourists today walk its stones aware that beneath their feet lie the remnants of a queen once crowned in gold and buried in shame. The indignity Henry inflicted upon Anne's body only deepened the fascination with her story, ensuring that what he meant to silence would instead echo through centuries. In that crude chest and unmarked grave lies the stark truth power not only kills, it controls memory. For Henry, Anne's burial was not an afterthought. It was the final act of his theatre of humiliation. When the crowd dispersed and the spectacle was over, it was not the executioner nor Cromwell's officials nor the king who bore the burden of what remained. It was the women. Anne Boleyn's ladies who had dressed her as queen, carried her child, and whispered prayers in her final hours were now commanded to tend to her mutilated body. Imagine the moment the scaffold still sticky with blood, the head and body lying apart, the smell of iron filling the air. These women, loyal to Anne to the end, were forced to gather her remains, to cradle the body of a queen stripped of life and dignity, to place it into the crude chest meant for arrows. It was an act of devotion, yes, but also of trauma. Their hands trembled, their sobs suppressed, for even grief had to be hidden under Henry's gaze. To mourn too openly was dangerous. To resist was treason. The shock of that morning did not end on Tower Green. Some of these women were haunted for years. Contemporary accounts and later testimony suggest that at least one of Anne's attendants left court entirely retreating to a convent, where silence offered some fragile refuge. Others carried nightmares, the sight of their mistress's body dismembered, the sound of the crowd gasping, the helpless knowledge that nothing they did could protect her. Life at the Tudor court was often painted as a tapestry of pageantry, music, jewels, and intrigue. But for women, it was also proximity to danger. To serve a queen was to stand close to the flame of power, and when that flame consumed her, the attendants were scorched as well. They shared in her disgrace, her fear, her shame. They learned firsthand the precariousness of female survival in Henry's world, where loyalty could become liability overnight. Parallels echo forward. Only a few years later, Catherine Howard, Anne's young cousin, and Henry's fifth wife would face the same scaffold. Once again, her ladies-in-waiting were dragged into the machinery of execution, interrogated, punished, and finally forced to bear witness to their mistress's destruction. The cycle was cruelly familiar, women watching women die, powerless to intervene, yet punished for their proximity. The trauma of Anne's attendants underscores a truth often overlooked: executions scarred more than the condemned. They rippled outward, leaving grief and fear in their wake. For every queen who fell, there were women who washed the blood from her body, who carried her clothes back to empty chambers, who woke in the night to screams only they could hear. In the silence after the crowd's roar in the shadows of the Tower Chapel, these women bore witness to both love and horror. Their loyalty was their punishment. And though history rarely records their names, the memory of their suffering clings to Anne's story like an echo, a reminder that the violence of Henry's court was not confined to the scaffold but seeped into the lives of all who stood too near. While Anne's body lay buried in silence, another life was already unravelling. In consequence, one too young to even understand, Elizabeth, the daughter who had once been hailed as a princess, was not yet 3 years old when her world was dismantled. Within days of her mother's death, Parliament declared her illegitimate. Her royal household, carefully assembled in the flush of her birth, was dismissed. Her servants scattered, her nurses replaced her clothing, neglected. The child who had been paraded as the hope of the Tudor line was reduced in an instant to little more than a political inconvenience. The cruelty was staggering in its pettiness. Elizabeth had no voice, no agency, no comprehension of the events unfolding in the Tower, and yet she bore the punishment meant for her mother. Court records reveal that after Anne's downfall, Elizabeth's care was neglected to the point of indignity. Proper clothing was denied her, her small household starved of funds, her position in the line of succession erased with the stroke of a quill. She had become a bastard-in-law branded by her father's will. This stripping of legitimacy was not only a blow to Elizabeth personally, but a calculated act of dynastic engineering. Henry VIII understood that succession was the bedrock of monarchy. By casting Elizabeth out of the line, he cleared the path for Jane Seymour and the male heir he desperately craved. The little girl's identity was rewritten by statute from princess to Lady Elizabeth, her place in the world remade by decree. In Tudor politics, children were pawns before they were ever people. Their legitimacy was currency, their names reshaped by the tides of royal desire. Elizabeth's fate was not unique. Medieval and early modern Europe was littered with children erased by the politics of their parents. The Wars of the Roses had seen princes declared bastards to suit the needs of rival claimants. Richard III himself had leaned on such legal fictions to strengthen his hold on the throne. Illegitimacy was not only stigma, it was a weapon once sharpened by law and aimed at those too young to defend themselves. But history carries its ironies. The child Henry had disowned would one day return as queen, proving stronger than the father who cast her aside. In that moment of disgrace, however, Elizabeth's future was anything but secure. She was a vulnerable child in a court that had turned cold, a symbol of failure rather than triumph, her very existence a reminder of the queen who had fallen so spectacularly. The broader pattern was unmistakable dynasties manipulated legitimacy like clay. Children were exalted or erased depending on their utility. One day a royal child could be the pride of a kingdom, the next they could be written out of history altogether. In Elizabeth's case, the punishment of the mother extended into the life of the daughter. Anne had been denied a coffin, Elizabeth was denied her name, and so the girl with flame-red hair and sharp eyes grew up in the shadow of disgrace, a child branded by the scaffold. Yet hidden within that cruelty was the seed of resilience, for in the years to come Elizabeth would carry not only the stigma of illegitimacy but also the memory of survival. The very act of being stripped down to nothing would forge in her the strength to become everything her father had once denied her. Tower Green. That May morning was not a cathedral of silence, but a theatre of noise, smell and spectacle. Anne Boleyn's scaffold, low and stark, did not stand upon clean boards. Executions at the Tower were not daily occurrences, but they were not rare either. The wood was likely already stained with blood from other deaths, buzzing with flies in the rising warmth. For the crowd gathered. There it was not only the sight of a queen's final moments, but the experience of the senses. Sweat dust whispers the metallic tang of fresh death. We imagine solemn silence, heads bowed, a dignified audience. The truth was far less reverent. Henry's government understood that executions were public pedagogy, moral lessons, carved in flesh. They were staged to instruct as much as to punish, and the crowd was a necessary instrument. Select nobles had been invited, their presence lending weight and legitimacy. Ambassadors stood ready to send their dispatches abroad. Ordinary witnesses, fewer than at Tyburn but still significant, crowded the edges, their chatter rising and falling as Anne mounted the scaffold. Among them, Henry's supporters were likely planted voices ready to jeer, to call out witch or adulteress, to transform the Queen's final walk into an echo chamber of condemnation. This manipulation of the crowd was part of Tudor political theatre. A public execution was a morality play. The condemned played the role of sinner, the scaffold, the stage of repentance, the audience both witness and chorus. Every cheer, gasp, or insult reinforced the intended narrative. When Anne knelt, she was not only submitting to death, but performing a lesson scripted by the state ambition punished, disobedience, crushed, female power humbled. And the crowd understood their role. In a society where literacy was limited, and law often invisible, spectacle was the primary language of authority. To see a queen die was to absorb a message no proclamation could convey, that no one, not even a woman, once crowned in gold, was beyond the king's reach. Fear seeped outward from Tower Green into taverns, markets and homes. Gossip carried the story further than sermons, embedding it into the very fabric of social life. The carnival atmosphere was deliberate. Tudor power was theatrical at its core, coronations, progresses, tournaments, masks. Death itself became another performance as carefully staged as any royal pageant. Where there had once been garlands and trumpets, now there were jeers and silence. Where once Anne had been paraded as a jewel, now she was displayed as a warning. And yet crowds were never entirely predictable. Even in this controlled setting, some wept, some fainted, some turned away in horror. The government could plant voices and frame the scene, but it could not fully control the human response to the sight of a young woman once adored, now decapitated before their eyes. In that tension between state script and human reaction lies the uneasy truth of Tudor executions. They were meant to terrify, to humiliate, to silence, but they also revealed power's desperation, its reliance on theatre to sustain authority. Anne's death was not simply watched, it was consumed, absorbed, retold. Each gasp, each muttered word, each rumour whispered beyond the tower walls carried Henry's intended lesson far and wide. The crowd was not a passive audience, they were the living instrument of the king's propaganda. Anne Boleyn's last speech, remembered by those who stood on Tower Green, has often been repeated as evidence of grace, of forgiveness, even of love for the king who condemned her. But to take those words at face value is to miss the deeper cruelty of the ritual. Her praise of Henry was not belief, it was necessity. In Tudor England, final words were not truly free. The condemned were expected to follow a script acceptance of the law, repentance for sins, and most importantly loyalty to the monarch. To deviate was dangerous. Words spoken at the scaffold did not vanish with the executioner's stroke. They were carried outward by the crowd, repeated in taverns and courts, written into chronicles, reported in ambassadorial dispatches. A defiant last speech could ignite unrest, even rebellion. A submissive one cemented the state's authority. Anne understood this. She had lived long enough at Henry's court to know the weight of every syllable. In those last moments, she could not risk her daughter's life by raging against her accusers or naming the king's betrayal. Even in death, Elizabeth's future hung on her tongue. If Anne were to speak rebellion, her child might be punished as a traitor's spawn. Silence was not an option, but truth was impossible. What remained was performance. So she praised Henry as a gracious and merciful prince. Historians have long debated the tone. Was it irony, defiance masked as submission, or simply resignation? Perhaps it was all three. What we can say with certainty is that these words were strategic. Anne did not confess guilt. She did not validate the charges of adultery, incest, or treason. Instead, she praised the king without conceding the crime. It was a delicate balance, obeying the ritual while leaving a trace of doubt. The politics of the scaffold turned even the dead into instruments of propaganda. The state required the condemned to provide their own testimony against themselves to legitimize the execution in the eyes of the audience. In this way, death became the crown's most powerful theatre. The body was destroyed, but the words lingered, recited like scripture to prove the justice of the blade. Censorship extended even here. Chroniclers who recorded Anne's speech did so, selectively editing, shaping, and sanitizing. Some versions were softened for foreign eyes, portraying Henry as merciful, the execution swift, the Queen serene. Others emphasized her obedience, erasing any hint of resistance. Even the dead could not escape Tudor spin. Anne's speech thus stands as both submission and defiance. Submission because she was forced to honor the king who had destroyed her. Defiance because she refused to confess guilt. Her words lived in the narrow space permitted to her, carefully measured, heavy with what was unsaid. And in this lies one of the deepest cruelties of Henry's theatre. Even at the very brink of death, a queen could not speak freely. Her head might fall in silence, but her words had already been chained. Anne Boleyn's death was not simply an execution. It was a production staged with the precision of a royal pageant, a final performance where every detail had been chosen not for justice but for theatre. The centrepiece of this performance was the French sword. Henry VIII had spared no expense to bring the famed Calais executioner across the Channel, a man known for his skill and efficiency. Chroniclers noted he had practiced his stroke on animals before arriving, ensuring that when the moment came his blade would cut clean in a single sweep. This was not routine justice, it was choreography. Henry did not want a botched end, the gruesome spectacle of repeated axe blows. He wanted a perfect death, one that could be dressed as mercy, even as it was in truth another act of cruelty. The sword itself became a symbol. Sleek, foreign, precise, it reflected the very image Henry wanted to project, the benevolent yet decisive monarch, a ruler who could destroy with elegance. But for Anne, the choice of sword stripped her of intimacy. She was to be dispatched not by the traditional English axe, but by a foreign method, as if even in death she was alien to her people. Henry had courted her with pageantry, now he discarded her with pageantry. And then came the ritual display, as ancient as empire. Once the blade had done its work, the executioner lifted Anne's severed head by the hair and held it high for the witnesses to see. Blood still ran from the wound, dripping onto the scaffold. The gesture was not incidental, it was a performance of power, a visual proclamation justice fulfilled, treason destroyed, the king's authority made visible in flesh. This act had deep roots in history. The Romans had paraded severed heads through the streets to silence rivals and terrify the people, Cicero's tongue nailed to the rostra as a warning to orators who dared oppose. In medieval Europe, heads were displayed on spikes over city gates, a gruesome herald to all who entered. In England, traitors' heads were boiled in tar and set upon London Bridge, their hollow eyes staring down at merchants and pilgrims. The lifting of Anne's head was part of this continuum, the transformation of a body into symbol of death, into public theatre. The crowd gasped. Some fainted. Others shouted approval. In that moment, Anne was reduced from queen to object, her humanity obliterated as her body was made into a prop. The clean stroke of the sword was not meant for her dignity. It was meant for the spectacle to ensure that the lesson of her fall would not be muddled by gore, but remembered as swift, decisive, and irrefutable. This was Henry's genius and his horror to turn the machinery of justice into drama, to stage not only life but death, where coronations had masks and processions' executions had scaffolds and blades. Both served the same purpose, to bind the people to the monarchy through awe and fear. Anne's death, then, was not her own. It belonged to the performance, to the ritual display of obedience and terror to the king who wrote the script and to the crowd who played their part. It was not an execution. It was theatre, a bloody pageant staged to erase a queen and enthrone fear in her place. Not all who witnessed Anne Boleyn's downfall were free to speak openly. Many in the Tower that spring were silenced by fear ambassadors who reported cautiously to their monarch's courtiers, who carefully shaped their words to match the king's narrative. But one voice, half-muted yet enduring, left behind something different: poetry. Thomas Wyatt, courtier, diplomat and poet, was imprisoned in the Tower during Anne's final days. His own cell was close enough that he may have heard the murmur of the crowd, the thud of scaffolding being built, perhaps even the muffled prayer that preceded the blade. Some whisper that Wyatt had once been Anne's admirer, maybe even her lover before she caught the king's eye. Whether that rumour holds truth or not, his verses carry the unmistakable weight of personal grief. In his poetry, Wyatt described a stag hunted to exhaustion, a deer caught in snares, the hind that belonged to Caesar. These metaphors, carefully veiled, were safer than names. Everyone in court could read between the lines. Anne was the hind pursued, possessed, destroyed by power. Wyatt's coded lament was resistance cloaked in artistry, grief smuggled past the censors in the only form that could survive verse. This was the paradox of Tudor oppression. Silence was enforced, but silence never entirely held. When courtiers dared not speak, they whispered. When whispers were dangerous, they wrote in allegory, in symbols, in verses that appeared innocent but pulsed with hidden meaning. Poetry, song, even rumour became the shadow archives of dissent. Wyatt's words did not defy Henry. Openly to do so would have been suicide. Instead, they worked as a mirror for those who already doubted, those who mourned Anne but could not risk saying so. His verses let grief survive. In code. In a court where names were erased from walls and initials scrubbed from palaces, poetry remembered what politics tried to forget. Nor was Wyatt alone. Ambassadorial letters written cautiously still betray unease. The Spanish envoy Chapuis reported the speed of Anne's fall, with disbelief, his tone carrying more scepticism than loyalty. Rumours in taverns, though dangerous, clung stubbornly to the idea that the charges against her were fabricated. Even silence itself became a form of dissent, a refusal to repeat the king's propaganda. Literature has always been the refuge of the powerless against erasure. In Rome, poets mocked emperors under the guise of satire. In Tudor England, Wyatt and others used verse as a shield, not enough to prevent Anne's destruction, but enough to carry the ember of her memory through the centuries. Where proclamations painted her as a traitor, poetry preserved her as a hunted, broken, yet still radiant figure, undone not by guilt but by power. The irony is sharp. Henry sought to erase Anne, yet the verses born in her shadow became one of the most enduring testaments to her. Wyatt's coded grief, too dangerous to speak plainly in 1536, is read freely today, long after the proclamations of her guilt have been discarded as theatre. Anne's body was silenced. Her name was scrubbed. But poetry, soft, veiled, persistent, carried her forward. The witnesses in verse ensured that what Henry tried to bury would continue to breathe. Anne Boleyn's body was hurried into the earth without coffin procession or prayer. But Henry VIII's project of annihilation did not end at the chapel floor. Her death was only the beginning of a larger erasure one that sought to scrub her from memory as thoroughly as from life. The orders were quiet but unmistakable. Portraits of Anne, the very images that had once proclaimed her as England's queen, were to be destroyed or hidden. Some were painted over her likeness, buried beneath new pigments. Others were simply discarded, vanishing into dust. In the palaces where she had once reigned, the intertwined monogram J. Henry and Anne was chiselled away or carefully altered. A reminder of intimacy became a risk, and so stone itself was instructed to forget. At court, silence became law. Those who had once flattered Anne learned to avoid her name. To speak it with admiration was dangerous, to speak it with pity equally so. Even her daughter Elizabeth was diminished in her mother's shadow, stripped of title, and treated as if she had never been legitimate at all. Anne was not simply executed, she was erased. This practice has a name older than the Tudors' Damnatio memoriae. The condemnation of memory. The Romans perfected it, chiselling names from inscriptions, toppling statues, turning emperors into phantoms. To erase a name was to kill twice, once in flesh, once in history. Later monarchs would follow the same path. Richard III was accused of doing so when the princes disappeared into the tower. Centuries after Anne Stalin's Soviet Union would retouch photographs to remove the faces of men who'd fallen from favour. The tools changed: chisels to paintbrushes to camera edits, but the impulse was the same. Power does not only kill, it edits. Henry's campaign against Anne bore all the marks of this ancient instinct. Her body had been denied the rituals of dignity. Now her memory was denied the rituals of remembrance. Where once London had echoed with her coronation bells, now it was as if she had never worn the crown at all. And yet Damnatio memoriae always reveals a paradox. The very effort to erase ensures survival in another form. We remember the Emperor's Rome tried to erase precisely because someone recorded the attempt. We remember Anne because Henry's silence was too deliberate to ignore his destruction, too thorough to pass unnoticed. To erase completely is impossible. Traces cling stubbornly in poetry and rumour in whispers at chapel altars. Anne's erasure was a lesson as much as her death. To Henry's court it signalled that even memory was subject to the king's will. To history it revealed the desperation of power when threatened by a woman's influence. The queen who had once reshaped religion and politics with her marriage was now painted out of the picture. The woman who had dared to defy tradition was reduced to nothing, or so Henry believed. The irony is that his attempt to erase Anne only made her story endure. Damnatio memoriae always fails in the long arc of history. The chisels cut stone, but they also leave scars. Scars that tell us exactly where the name once was. And in the end, the silence around Anne became its own testimony, a shadow too sharp to disappear. The violence of Anne Boleyn's execution did not end with the sword or with the hurried burial. In many ways, its most enduring cruelty came afterward, when Henry VIII's government set about rewriting the story into something more palatable, something that cast the king not as a tyrant but as a merciful prince. The centrepiece of this revision was the French swordsman. To contemporaries, the importation of a skilled executioner at great expense was spun as proof of Henry's compassion. He had chosen the swiftness of the sword over the blundering English axe, they said, to spare Anne pain. A man who had ordered his wife's death was now recast as a husband, reluctant to cause her suffering. The brutality of the act was reframed as benevolence. This was propaganda at its most effective, reshaping horror into virtue. And it did not stop with the choice of weapon. Official narratives downplayed the delays that had tortured Anne in her final days, ignored the jeering voices planted in the crowd, and emphasised her calm composure as evidence that justice had been done. Chroniclers close to the crown described the execution as solemn, dignified, almost merciful. The filth, the flies, the chest used for her body, all of these were scrubbed from the record. The Tudor state understood that power was not only enforced with steel, but curated with words. Sermons from pulpits echoed the official line. Anne had sinned, Henry had shown mercy, God's justice had been fulfilled. Ambassadors careful to please often repeated this version in dispatches abroad, their reports tinged with the language of inevitability and order. In these retellings, Anne was not a victim of a ruthless purge, but a guilty woman who had been granted the kindness of a swift end. This manipulation of narration was part of a larger Tudor strategy. The monarchy thrived on image, and image had to be controlled at all costs. The same machinery that had once promoted Anne as the radiant queen, her coronation pageants, her triumphal entry into London, her portrayal as England's hope was now repurposed to bury her reputation. Portraits vanished, initials were erased, chronicles were edited. Memory itself became a battlefield. History was not merely written, it was curated. What people remembered was shaped by what they were allowed to say. To speak too sympathetically of Anne was to risk suspicion. Safer to repeat the official narrative: the king had been merciful, the queen had confessed her sins in silence, and the kingdom had been purged of corruption. And yet propaganda always carries a shadow of its own. The very insistence on Henry's mercy betrayed the truth it sought to hide. If her death had truly been just, there would have been no need to gild it with compassion. The sword's clean stroke was dressed in the robes of benevolence, but beneath them lay the stark reality: a young queen falsely accused, decapitated to clear a path for another marriage. For a time the narrative held. In taverns and villages, people repeated what they had been told. The story was streamlined, the king had acted with dignity, the queen had accepted her guilt, the execution had been merciful. But propaganda has a half-life. With each generation, the contradiction showed through. The whispers of those who remembered differently, the poetry of Wyatt, the unease in ambassadorial letters, these left cracks in the official story. Henry's government had curated history for survival, but history has a way of outliving propaganda. The memory of Anne Boleyn endured not as a grateful sinner, dispatched by a merciful king, but as a queen destroyed by fear, politics, and the cruelty of erasure. The state had sharpened the sword, but it could not dull the truth forever. If Henry VIII had hoped Anne's death would close a chapter, his haste betrayed the truth. It was not closure he sought, but replacement. On the very next day after Anne's execution, he became betrothed to Jane Seymour. Within 2 weeks they were married at Whitehall, in a quiet ceremony that made no space for mourning. The speed was staggering even by Tudor standards. Where one queen had been buried in silence, another was lifted into the light almost immediately. This haste revealed Henry's true obsession, not justice, not even personal satisfaction, but heirs. Anne had given him a daughter, but no son. Jane Seymour was believed to be fertile, pliant, capable of producing the male heir Henry craved to secure the Tudor dynasty. To Henry, Anne's death was not tragedy, but solution, the removal of an obstacle on the road to dynastic security. Dynasty in the 16th century was a fragile thing. Monarchs were haunted by the spectre of extinction, of succession crises, like the Wars of the Roses, where disputed claims had plunged England into chaos. For Henry, the absence of a male heir was not only a personal disappointment but a political danger. His desperation to produce a son had already cost him one wife in Catherine of Aragon, and now it had claimed Anne. And yet history delights in irony. The son Henry eventually gained from Jane Seymour would die young, leaving no legacy beyond a brief troubled reign. The child Henry had cast aside, Elizabeth, stripped of her title, branded a bastard, would rise to rule England for nearly half a century. The very daughter Anne bore the one Henry tried to erase through her mother's disgrace, became Elizabeth of Furor. The Virgin Queen, the architect of the Elizabethan age. A monarch remembered among the greatest in English history. Henry had erased Anne's name from palaces, ordered her portraits destroyed, declared her daughter illegitimate. But Elizabeth carried her mother's legacy in her blood. The wit, the intelligence, the sharp eyes that had once charmed and unsettled Henry's court returned in his daughter, now seated on the throne. Every triumph of Elizabeth's reign, the defeat of the Armada, the flourishing of the arts, the age of exploration, became an unspoken monument to the woman Henry had tried to bury in silence. Anne's execution was meant as erasure. Instead, it became a paradox: the mother erased, the daughter immortal. The humiliation on Tower Green could not prevent the echo that followed in Westminster Abbey when Elizabeth was crowned queen. The crude chest that held Anne's body was balanced in history's scales by the golden crown placed upon her daughter's head. This is the final lesson of Anne Boleyn's fall. Power can kill, humiliate, and attempt to silence. It can order the chisels to scrape initials from stone command courtiers to forget pay scribes to rewrite the story. But power cannot control memory forever. The truth seeps through cracks, the silenced voices find echoes, and the erased names resurface in defiance. Henry sought to annihilate Anne. What he created instead was a legacy that outlived him. A daughter who bore her mother's fire and a reign that turned erasure into triumph. Anne Boleyn's body was buried in silence. Her name was spoken in whispers, but her legacy endured in the laughter, wit, and indomitable will of a queen who reshaped an age. Her death was meant as erasure. In the end, it became remembrance. When erasure fails, lessons from Anne Boleyn's final hours history often remembers Anne Boleyn as a cautionary tale, the queen who rose too high and fell too far, destroyed by a king's will. Yet when we look closer beyond the pageantry of her coronation and the horror of her execution, her story offers something more enduring. It is not only a Tudor tragedy, but a meditation on power, memory, and survival. Anne's death shows us how institutions use spectacle to reinforce authority. Her execution was not a private reckoning, but a performance designed for impact. The French sword, the scaffold lowered to strip her of dignity, the jeering crowd serving as chorus. Tudor England blurred the line between justice and theatre teaching subjects, obedience through ritualized cruelty. From this we learn that systems of power often depend on appearances. What is staged in public, the narrative, the imagery, the ritual can matter more than truth itself. Recognizing this pattern helps us navigate our own world where performance often masks intent. Another lesson lies in the manipulation of memory. Henry VIII did not only want Anne dead, he wanted her forgotten. Portraits were destroyed, initials carved away, her daughter declared illegitimate. Yet Damnatio memoriae, the erasure of memory, never fully succeeds. The attempt to silence Anne became the very reason we remember her. Scars on stone tell us that names were once there. Whispers in poetry like Thomas Wyatt's verses carried her legacy through the shadows. In our own lives, we are reminded that truth, however buried, has a stubborn way of resurfacing. Attempts to erase it only deepen its imprint. Anne's story also reflects the cruelty of dynastic obsession, the reduction of human life to utility. She was discarded for failing to produce a son, her child punished for existing as the wrong heir. History warns us here of the dangers of treating people as means rather than ends. When love, loyalty, or even parenthood is subordinated to ambition, destruction follows. In our modern age, where success is often measured by output, Anne's fate reminds us of the cost of valuing people for what they can provide rather than who they are. Yet perhaps the greatest lesson lies in the irony of her legacy. Henry's haste to replace Anne, his obsession with sons, his ruthless propaganda, all were undone by the very child he tried to disown. Elizabeth, daughter of the disgraced queen, rose to define an era. The Elizabethan age stands as a monument to Anne's survival in memory, proof that erasure is never total. Here is the hopeful truth. What is denied in one generation may bloom in another. What seems like defeat may be seed. In the end, Anne Boleyn's story is not simply about death. It is about resilience, the resilience of memory, of truth, of legacy. Power may silence voices, but it cannot silence echoes. The lessons of her fall invite us to guard our dignity, to question the performances of authority, to honour truth even when it trembles, and to believe that what is cast aside today may yet rise tomorrow. Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.